Before we begin understand this, she was not born into power. She was not born into love. She was born in a cellar, by candlelight, to a woman who had nothing, and she was given, at 19 years old, like a piece of furniture being relocated, to the coldest man in the known vampire world. They said she was the most beautiful girl alive. They said it like it was a gift. It was never a gift. Beauty, when you are nobody, is just a more elegant cage. This is the story of Vaelith, the girl they called a ghost, a bastard, a mistake, and Kedron, the prince of iron and frost, who looked at her like she was beneath him, right up until the night he saw her dance. And then nothing was ever the same again. The baby was born without a midwife, without a healer, without so much as a warm word from the floor above, in the deep underbelly of Drevhol Estate, in a room that had previously been used for storing excess linen. A woman named Asen bit down on a strip of her own apron and delivered her daughter alone. No bells rang, no announcement was made. The lord of the estate, Vaelith Ashmore, sat 3 floors above in his study with a glass of aged blood wine, and he did not move from his chair. He had been informed of the situation 2 months prior, in the calm, clipped tones of his head steward, and he had responded with the only words he seemed to have available: "Handle it quietly." Quietly then, Asen lay back against the damp pillow and held the infant against her chest, and for a long time she simply breathed in, out, the baby breathing too, small and furious and perfect, and the candle on the crate guttered in some draught from under the door, sending their shadow leaping across the stone wall like something trying to escape. She looked at her daughter's face. Even minutes old, even in the near dark, the face was extraordinary. She could see it already, the symmetry, the dark eyes already too aware for a newborn, already watching, already taking in the world with a kind of patient, unblinking attention that felt less like an infant's instinct and more like recognition. "I know this place," those eyes seemed to say. "I know what it is. I already know." Asen pressed her lips to the top of the small dark head. "Vaelith," she whispered. Her voice was wrecked from the effort and the grief and the love, all 3 arriving together the way catastrophes do. "I'll name you Vaelith. It means she who endures. I know that's a heavy name for something so small, but I think you can carry it. I think I already know you can carry anything." The baby made a sound against her chest. The candle burned a little lower. Above them, 3 floors up, Vaelith Ashmore refilled his glass. When Lady Mevra Ashmore discovered the truth 3 months after the birth, when pretending had become logistically impossible, she did not scream. She did not weep. She did not throw things or rage, or perform any of the dramatic spectacles that the lower staff had quietly, nervously anticipated. She walked into the drawing room in her burgundy gown with her copper hair pinned perfectly and her rubies at her throat, and she sat in the great velvet chair by the fire with the posture of a woman who has decided the shape of the rest of this conversation before entering it. She looked at Asen, kneeling on the stone floor with the baby. She looked at the baby's face. Something moved behind her green eyes, something that, if it were any other woman, might have been almost an involuntary awe at the face of that child. But Lady Mevra had been a nobleman's wife for 200 years, and she had learned to bury involuntary responses under several feet of very cold, very controlled composure. She looked away from the baby. She looked at her husband. 4 words: "She stays below stairs." That was all. Vaelith had the decency, or perhaps just the cowardice, to look at the floor. So it was arranged. The child would be kept in the lower quarters. Asen would retain her position as laundry maid, on the condition that she raise the child with absolute quiet and bring her upstairs for no reason ever, under any circumstance, without explicit permission. The child would be fed. The child would be housed. The child would be tolerated. That was the full extent of what she was owed. "And the child's name?" the head steward asked later, for the official household record. Vaelith paused. "Whatever the mother chose," he said. And so, in the official household record of Drevhol Estate, a single line was added beneath the legitimate family entries. In slightly smaller script with no title and no father's name noted. Vaelith, female, half-blood, below stairs. That was all she was on paper. That was all she was allowed to be. By the time she could walk steadily on her own 2 feet, Vaelith had chores. This was not unusual in itself. Even the households of wealthy vampire lords expected their lower-floor children to contribute. But there was an important distinction, she would eventually understand, between given work and put on display. Vaelith was put on display, not obviously. No one stood over her and announced it, but she was assigned the courtyard scrubbing, which was done in the open where anyone walking the estate grounds could see. She was sent to collect wood from the outer store, which required crossing the main garden where the family took their afternoon gatherings. She was placed, repeatedly and strategically, in rooms and corridors and courtyards where the legitimate daughters of the house were likely to find her and do whatever they were going to do. Princess Thessaly Ashmore was 9 years old and already fully formed in her cruelty. She had her mother's bone-deep sense of entitlement and her father's habit of delivering wounds in quiet, precise language rather than loud blows. She crouched down beside Vaelith in the courtyard one autumn afternoon, tilted her golden head, and said pleasantly, "You missed a spot. Right there. Are you blind? Or just slow?" Vaelith scrubbed harder. She did not look up. "Don't bother talking to her," Thessaly told her younger sister, Valara, who was peering at Vaelith's face with that particular 6-year-old intensity that has not yet learned to be disguised. "She barely speaks. She's practically a ghost. Father's shameful little ghost. Why are her eyes so dark?" Valara asked, ignoring her sister's instruction entirely, leaning close enough that Vaelith could feel the girl's breath on her cheek. "Mama says it means she's low-born. Is that true? Is that why you look like that, because you're low-born?" Vaelith pressed her lips together and kept scrubbing. They walked away. Their skirts swept over the stones she had just cleaned. She held the brush very tightly for a moment, her knuckles blanching. Then she loosened her grip, slowly, deliberately. She had learned this the deliberate loosening her mother had taught her. In the small quiet spaces between laundry loads and candlelit evenings, feel it, and then release it. Don't let it live in your hands. It will turn into stone if you let it live in your hands. That night, in her small room, Vaelith sat against the cold wall and breathed very carefully. She had learned the breathing too. In 4 counts, hold, 4 counts, out, 4 counts. Her mother had said, "When the world is too loud, make yourself still. The still thing always outlasts the loud thing." She was 7 years old. She had already filled an entire room inside herself, a room she built and locked and tended carefully, with all the things she felt that she could not let out. The room was getting crowded, but it was hers. It was the only private thing she had. The laundry room was the warmest place in Drevhull estate, not metaphorically. Literally the constant boiling of water, the steam that clung to every surface, the heat radiating from the great stone hearth that kept the water hot. The laundry room was the one place in the estate where cold could not quite reach, where even in the depths of the estate's brutal winters, you could push open the heavy wooden door and feel something loosen in your chest. It was also where Ossen worked. And so, for Vaelith, it was home. Every evening after her chores were done, she would find her mother here, wrists red from the hot water, back bent from the wringing, hair escaping whatever she'd pinned it into, and she would climb onto the low stool in the corner and watch. Ossen was extraordinary, in the way of people who have been given very little and learned to do a great deal with it. She had taught herself to read from discarded household ledger pages. She had taught herself 3 forms of arithmetic from a mathematics primer left in the staff quarters by a previous employee. She spoke with more precision and grace than most of the nobility above her, and she had decided, from the very first days of Vaelith's life, that her daughter would be no different. "Say it again," she would prompt, after Vaelith stumbled over a word. Not unkindly, firmly, not because you need to impress anyone, because the words are yours. Words belong to whoever learns them. They can't take that from you. "Mama, why do they hate me?" She was 8 when she asked it, directly, cleanly, the way children ask the things. Adults have spent years learning to dress up in softer language. Asen was quiet for a moment. Her hands kept moving, folding, smoothing, stacking. She always kept her hands moving when she was thinking something important. They don't hate you, she said finally. They do. They hate what you make them feel. Vaelith frowned. What do I make them feel? Asen looked at her daughter, looked at her face, which was, at 8, already a kind of quiet, unassuming revelation. A face that made strangers pause mid-sentence. A face that drew stares even in a household that was trying, collectively, to unsee her. Small, Asen said. You make them feel small, without doing anything at all. And people do terrible things to whatever makes them feel small. Then what do I do? Nothing. You do nothing. You stay exactly as you are. And you wait. Wait for what? Asen smiled, slow and a little sad and completely certain. For the day their smallness is no longer your problem. Vaelith turned this over in her mind for weeks. She was not sure she understood it yet, but she kept it. At 11, Vaelith understood something she could not have put into words at 7, but now felt with the precision of a fact. Her face was a problem that would not go away. It had been growing as a problem for some time. A visiting nobleman had paused in the middle of a sentence to watch her cross the courtyard. She had been carrying linens. She was 11. She had not understood what was happening until she heard the nobleman's companion lean over and murmur something. And then they both laughed in the slightly embarrassed way of people who have just been caught by their own instincts. Thessaly had seen, after that, the cruelties that had previously been mostly verbal accelerated. The bucket of ice water was not an accident. Nothing in Drevhall estate was ever an accident. Every slight had an architect. Every cruelty had a designer. The upper maid who held the bucket had been spoken to by someone. The timing, the precise moment Vaelith turned the corner had been calculated. The water hit her like a wall of cold. She stopped walking. She did not gasp. She had trained herself, without quite realizing she was training herself, not to give sounds to pain. Sounds invited attention. Attention invited more. She stood in the cold corridor, completely soaked. Straight black hair pressed against her pale face like ink on paper. Water pooling around her shoes. And she did not react. Thessaly was a few paces behind the maid, arms folded, watching with the particular, careful blankness of someone who needs to be able to say they were simply passing through. How dreadful, she said, in a voice of perfect insincerity. Someone must have left that there. How careless. Vaelith peeled her hair back from her face slowly. She looked at Thessaly for one brief, clear moment. Then she picked up the empty linen basket she had dropped in the shock and continued walking. She heard the maid say, behind her, "Gods, she doesn't even blink. It's like she doesn't feel it." And Thessaly quietly, "She doesn't, she's hollow. That's what happens when you're born the way she was born. There's nothing inside." Vaelith walked around the corner and into the empty alcove behind the tapestry and sat down on the cold floor and wrapped her arms around her knees. She shook for about 30 seconds, hard, silent, controlled the shaking of a body that is processing something it was not allowed to process in front of the people who caused it. Then she stopped. She breathed in 4 counts, hold, out. Then she stood up, straightened the soaked dress as best she could, and went back to work. She was 11 years old and she had already mastered something most adults never learn, feeling everything and showing nothing. He summoned her once, just once, in all the years she lived in his house. 3 days after the bucket incident, she never knew how he heard, whether a sympathetic maid had whispered it up the chain, whether the head steward had noted it in his rounds. She was called to the study. She had never been inside it before. She stood on the carpet before the desk and looked at him with the same clear, unhurried attention with which she looked at most things, and she watched him not know what to do with her. "I've been informed there was an incident," he said. She said nothing. Were you? She waited. "Are you well?" she almost asked him. Well compared to what? Well compared to whom? But she had already understood at 11 that certain questions were more useful than others, and that particular question would only close this conversation down. So she said, "I manage, my lord." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something that, if it were processed differently in a different man, might have been something like seeing her for the first time, but it settled instead into the expression of a man cataloging a problem. "You won't be troubled again," he said. "I'll speak to." "Please don't." He blinked. She continued, careful and quiet, "With respect. If you speak to them on my behalf, it will be worse for me after you do. They'll know I said something. She paused. "I know how to manage this. I've been managing it. Please leave it alone." Silence. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first time. She could remember him looking at her, that combination of bewilderment and something else, something underneath it that he had decided very long ago not to examine. "You're very composed," he said, finally, as if this was the only thing he had available. "My mother taught me," she said. She was very composed. The word was set in the space between them like a stone. He looked away first. She dipped a brief, correct bow and left. In the corridor, once the door was closed, her hands shook for precisely 10 seconds. She counted. She always counted. It helped. Then she clasped them together and walked on. Her mother died when she was 12. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories, where deaths arrive with weather and portent and last-minute declarations. Asen died on a Tuesday afternoon in the laundry room, which was both the cruelest and somehow the most honest place for it. The room that had always been her world, that had always been both her burden and her shelter. It was a fever that had gone untreated for 2 weeks because healers were called to the upper floors when the upper floors needed them, and the lower floors were expected to manage on their own. It had not been managed. Vaelith was the one who found her. She had gone to the laundry room at the usual time and found her mother on the floor beside the cooling washtub, already past help, already past hearing. She sat with her for a long time before she called anyone. She sat with her hands wrapped around her mother's still ones, in the room that had always been warm, which was now growing cold, and she did not make a sound. She did not eat properly for a week after. She did not speak, except when absolutely required, for 3 weeks after that. Nobody above stairs noticed. The lower staff were gentle in their small, careful ways. An extra piece of bread left on her windowsill, a hand on her shoulder in passing, but they had their own grief, their own lives, their own survival to manage. A 12-year-old who had gone quiet was not something anyone could afford to carry. The storage hall she found by accident. A sleepless night. She stood in it and waited to feel something other than the suffocating static of loss. She did not know what to call it. She had never been taught to dance. She had never seen dancing except for the distant sounds of music filtering down from the upper floors during formal events she was not invited to attend. But her body knew things her mind hadn't been taught. Her body knew the shape of grief, knew that it needed to become motion or it would become stone. Her feet knew the cold floor. Her arms knew how to reach for something above her. Her spine knew how to curve and open and release. She danced her mother's voice. She danced the laundry room steam. She danced the courtyard bucket and Thessaly's studied contempt, and her father's guilty eyes. She danced the word hollow and the word bastard and the word ghost. She danced all of it until she was breathless and trembling on the stone floor. And then she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and breathed. And the grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It was bearable now. It had been moved from inside her chest to outside her body. into the space around her, and the room had absorbed it into the stone. She went back the next night, and the night after, and every night after that. It became her only true private thing, the one space in all of Drevhall estate where she was not a problem, not a shame, not an object, not a ghost. In that storage hall, in that moonbeam, she was only motion and music she made for herself. She danced through 12, 13, 14. She danced through the humiliations and the cold floors and the years. She danced through 15, 16, 17. No one ever saw her. This was, for a long time, both the protection and the tragedy of it. She was 19 when the world above stairs suddenly decided it had use for her. She was serving the second course when she heard her fate. There has been a development, her father said, in the careful tone he used when delivering news. He had already decided the shape of and was performing deliberation about for the benefit of the room. She moved between the candelabras. She had been doing this since she was old enough to hold a tray, moving through rooms full of people having conversations that were not for her, becoming so precisely invisible that the conversations continued as if she were furniture. She had become very good at furniture. King Vasteran of the Drevic dynasty has proposed peace terms. Valdric continued. The conflict over the northern boundary territories has been ongoing for 11 years. He wants it resolved. Finally, Lady Mevra said, in the tone of someone who has been saying finally about this for 11 years. His terms include a marriage alliance, a silence, the particular silence of a table at which there are two unmarried daughters, both doing rapid calculations. A marriage alliance, Thessaly repeated, smoothing her gown. The Crown Prince Kedron. Father, surely. The Crown Prince Kedron Drevig. Yes. Thessaly sat up straighter. Vaelith knew that posture, the subtle inflation of someone who has not yet allowed themselves to hope but is building the architecture of it quietly. He has asked, Valdric continued, for someone young, adaptable, someone who will not create political complications in his court, someone who will not be a rival, Lady Mevra translated crisply, someone who will cause no difficulty. Then, and here there was a pause. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In this one, it was long enough for every person at the table to do the same math. Vaelith set down the silver dish very carefully. She was aware of her hands. She was aware of the sound of her own breathing. She was aware of the way the candlelight shifted when Thessaly's head turned not toward the table, but toward the side of the room, toward her. Kedron's emissary passed through the Western Territories 2 months ago, Valdric said, to the tablecloth rather than to his wife or daughters. He sent a report to the Drevic court. They made a specific request. Valdric, Lady Mevra's voice had dropped half an octave. You cannot be saying a specific request for the girl described in the report. She is my blood, Valdric said, and then, clearly surprised by his own sentence, amended, she is of this house. The blood bond is valid. The alliance would be legally recognized. Valara made a sound, part laugh, part disbelief. The maid's daughter? Father, this is, they want the Valara. Lady Mevra's voice cut the sentence clean through. A long silence. Vaelith stood at the sideboard and breathed. In 4 counts, hold. Lady Mevra reached for her blood wine, took a long, deliberate sip, set the glass down with the soft precision of a woman who has made a decision. If it ends the conflict, she said quietly. If it removes her from this house. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nobody looked at Vaelith. Nobody asked her anything. She stood at the sideboard in her gray dress, in the room where she had spent 7 years serving food she did not eat to people who pretended she was not there, and the rest of her life was settled between the second and third courses of dinner. Not because anyone thought of her, because someone had noticed her face, because that was all she had ever been to anyone above stairs, a face that caused problems. Now she would be a face that solved one. She picked up the empty tray. She walked out of the dining room. In the corridor, alone, she stood against the cold stone. wall and pressed the back of her head against it and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was stone. The ceiling was exactly as it had always been. She stays below stairs. That had been the first sentence of her life. Now here was the second. She pressed her mother's ring through the fabric of her collar. She breathed, and then slowly, quietly, in the dark of the corridor where no one could see, she began to think. They told her formally in the morning, the head steward, formal household tones, the vocabulary of arrangement and alliance, and duty and the honor of being, selected actual words used, actual straight face maintained. She listened. She nodded at the correct places. She said, "I understand and thank you and of course." Then she went to her room and sat on the edge of her cot and thought for a very long time. She thought about what it meant, not what they wanted it to mean, the ending of a problem, the disposal of an inconvenience dressed up as an honor. What it meant for her. It meant leaving. She turned this over carefully, leaving. No more gray corridors and lower floor ceilings and the specific quality of cold that only exists in rooms you are not supposed to be in. No more Lady Mevra's precise, jeweled cruelty. No more Thessaly's calculated contempt. No more Valara's bright-eyed carelessness. No more serving dinners she didn't eat at a table she couldn't sit at. No more her father's guilty eyes, looking at her and looking away, over and over, for 19 years. It also meant a man she did not know, a court she did not know, the largest, most powerful vampire dynasty in the Northern Territories and its crown prince, Kedron, of whom she knew two things, that he was cold, and that he was proud, and that the combination of those two things in powerful men had, in her experience, never been anything other than a source of damage. She pressed her mother's ring to her lips. "I don't know what's ahead," she said to the cold, empty room, to the cracked mirror, to the ghost of the woman who had loved her, "but I know what's behind me, and it hasn't killed me. 7 years of gray floors, and cold water, and being called hollow, and being called nothing, and being made as small as one person can make another." She paused. "It hasn't killed me, Mama." The candle burned a little lower. "And I'm not hollow." She sat up straighter on the edge of the cot. "I have an entire room inside me full of everything I was never allowed to say. And I have 19 years of watching people carefully and learning their shapes. And I know how to be still when the world wants me to break a breath. Whatever this man is, whatever that court is, I have walked into hostile rooms before. I know how to survive them." She looked at the cracked mirror. She looked at her own face, the face that had, her entire life, been a problem, a complication, a variable that disturbed things merely by existing. "Maybe it's time," she said quietly, "for it to be useful." The candle went out. She sat in the dark for a long time, and somewhere very deep inside her, in that room she had built and filled and carefully locked for 19 years, something that had been waiting a very long time for permission finally quietly, without announcement, stood up. They gave her one gown, pale ivory, minimal embroidery at the collar, technically the finest garment she had ever owned, technically a kindness, if you measured kindness by the lowest possible bar. Lady Mevra oversaw the fitting with the expression of a woman, completing a dreaded administrative task that has, fortuitously, turned out to require slightly less effort than anticipated. "Lift your arms, turn, stand straighter, not like that, properly." "I am standing properly, Lady Mevra." A silence like the pause before a door is closed. "You're developing quite a habit of answering back." "I've always answered back. You've only just started listening." Thessaly made a sound from the corner. It might have been a laugh. She turned it into a cough quickly. Lady Mevra's expression traveled through several states rapidly and settled on the particular one she used when she had decided not to dignify something with a response. She looked at the seamstress. "That's fine. We're done." "The ring," Vaelith said, as she was being unpinned. "My mother's ring. I'm taking it." Lady Mevra looked at the chain at Vaelith's throat. The cracked silver ring, small and unremarkable and worth nothing by any material measure. It belonged to my mother, who gave it to me. I'm taking it. Another silence. This one lasted long enough to have an entire conversation inside it. Lady Mevra looked away first. Take it then. We're done here. Vaelith was led back to her room to pack her single trunk. A few gray dresses worn but kept clean. A winter shawl. The mathematics primer she had read until the pages came loose. She packed quickly. She didn't linger over anything, except the book. Her mother's handwriting was in the margins, small and precise. Notes and observations added over years of reading by candlelight. She pressed it flat to the bottom of the trunk first, before anything else. The words are yours. Words belong to whoever learns them. She closed the trunk. She did not look around the room for the last time. There was nothing here worth the memory. She went to the storage hall for the last time. She had not planned to dance. She had planned simply to stand in the moonbeam for a while, to say goodbye to it the way you say goodbye to a place that kept you alive, even while everything around it was trying to make you believe you weren't worth keeping. But the moonlight fell through the window in its familiar column. Her feet moved. She danced for her mother first, the humming, the warmth, the laundry room that always smelled of clean cloth and soap and safety. She danced the weight of that small body in her arms when she was very young, the feeling of being held by someone who would hold her for exactly as long as they were allowed to. She danced the grief of losing that. Then she danced the years, all of them gray-dressed and quiet and careful, moving through rooms where she was unwelcome, carrying things for people who pretended she didn't exist, filling that room inside herself with everything she could not say. She danced the cold water in the corridor and the word hollow, and every time she had breathed for counts, in a dark alcove, shaking, waiting to stop shaking. She danced the storage hall itself the first night she had found it, 12 years old and her chest full of something she couldn't hold, pushing open an unfamiliar door and finding this gift, this column of light, this room where no one wanted anything from her. Thank you, the dance said. For a long time, she danced thank you, and then she stopped. She stood in the moonbeam, breathing hard, hair wild, face wet. The stone floor was cold against her bare feet. She looked up at the window. The moon was high and clear and indifferent, the way all beautiful things are indifferent. I don't know what comes next, she thought. I don't know what that man is. I don't know what that place will do to me. But I am not hollow. I have never been hollow. I am so full of everything they threw at me and everything it taught me that I barely have room left for fear. She looked at the moonbeam for a long moment. She reached up and pressed her mother's ring against her throat. Then she walked out of the storage hall, back through the quiet lower floor corridors, and back to her room to sleep. She did not look back. 3 days of carriage and she watched the world change. Drevhull territory had always looked how it felt, neither poor nor grand. A landscape that had not committed to anything. Low hills, gray fields, the damp, uncertain green of places that have never been sure of themselves. The Drevic territory was sure. The moment the carriage crossed the border, marked by twin stone obelisks carved with the Drevic dynasty sigil, a wolf mid-leap beneath a crescent moon, both worn by weather and time, and still entirely intimidating. The atmosphere changed. The mountains sharpened. The forest darkened to something that felt less like trees and more like a decision. The air grew thinner and colder and cleaner. The way very old and very powerful things are always clean. They have long since burned away anything unnecessary. She pressed her hand against the carriage window when the castle first appeared. She had been prepared for large. She had not been prepared for this. For the feeling of looking at something that had been here longer than anything she had ever known, that had seen kingdoms rise and fall around it and remained, that carried centuries in its stones the way living things carry scars. Drevic Castle rose from the Black Mountain without apology. Its towers reached toward the dawn sky and did not quite touch it, which somehow made them more frightening than if they had. The gates were iron, older than anyone she would ever know. The walls were black stone, smooth and ancient, with windows that at this hour were lit from within by a blue-white light. That was not firelight. It was not beautiful in any comfortable sense. It was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they are entirely, unapologetically themselves. She kept her hand on the cold glass until the carriage passed through the gates. Then she folded her hands in her lap, straightened her spine, and breathed in 4 counts. Hold. You've survived hostel rooms before, she told herself. You've never seen one this size, another part of her answered. Then we adapt, she said back. And the carriage came to a stop. The courtyard went silent when she stepped out. She had expected scrutiny. She had lived her whole life under scrutiny of one kind or another. She knew how to walk through it, how to let it wash off, how to keep her face empty and her back straight and her eyes forward. What she had not expected was the scale of it. Approximately 30 people, staff, stewards, a cluster of courtiers who had apparently come out of what she could only assume was strategic curiosity, the kind that needed to gather information early. They had been talking when the carriage arrived. They had been performing the ordinary tasks of mourning. And then the carriage door opened, and she stepped onto the stone, and every one of them stopped. Not quickly, in stages. The way a room quiets when something enters it that the room does not have a word for yet. She heard the whispers start after 3 seconds. She had good hearing. She had trained herself to have good hearing. Quiet girls who need to know what's happening around them learn quickly to listen with the whole body. Is that her? Ashmore's bastard daughter, they said. No one told me she looked. Gods, that face. She looked at the castle. The castle was made of black stone that had been here for centuries and did not care what anyone thought of it. She found this, in the moment, deeply comforting. The head steward, gray-haired, precise, a man who had clearly been doing this job for long enough to have learned to be unruffled by most things, descended the steps and bowed with formal correctness. Lady Vaelith Ashmore, I am Rovin, head steward of Drevik Castle. Welcome. You will be shown to your chambers to rest before the formal introduction this evening. Thank you, she said, clearly, quietly. He led her inside. She walked through the great iron doors with her head level. Behind her, clearly audible even over the sound of the doors, one of the courtiers, male, voice not quite quiet enough. No one told me. Why did no one tell me? She let the doors close behind her. He found her before the formal introduction. He told himself later that it was not deliberate, that he happened to be using that corridor, that the timing was coincidental. He believed this entirely, which was how you could tell it was not true. The truth was that Kedron Drevik had been receiving reports on the situation for 2 weeks dry, administrative reports from his father's stewards, vocabulary of alliance and blood status and political utility. And he had processed these reports the way he processed most things, efficiently, without curiosity, with the quiet contempt of a man who has agreed to something out of duty and has decided in advance that it will require the minimum possible amount of his actual attention. He had agreed to the marriage the way you agree to a tax, unpleasant, necessary, manageable. He had not asked what she looked like. This had seemed 2 weeks ago like information that was beside the point. It no longer seemed beside the point. He saw her from the far end of the corridor, about 40 feet of cold blue lit shadow between them, and he stopped walking. She was standing before the mirror. She was looking at herself with an expression he couldn't categorize immediately, which was itself unusual. He was very good at categorizing expressions. He could read a room, a face, a political calculation faster than most people could see it coming. It was his most useful quality, and he knew it. But her expression, it was not what he had built in his mind. He had built grateful, slightly overwhelmed, performing composure over visible anxiety, the specific look of someone who knows they have been given more than they were born to and is trying not to appear as stunned as they feel. That was not what this was. This was the expression of a soldier checking her equipment before a battle. He stood at the end of the corridor, and that was enough to throw him just slightly, just barely, just enough that he did not immediately continue walking. 3 seconds, he counted them. Then she turned from the mirror and saw him. He had expected a flinch, a too deep curtsy, eyes flying immediately to the floor. Her dark eyes met his, clear, direct, present, performing defiance, simply the steady, undisguised attention of someone who looks at things as they actually are. Then her gaze dropped, correct and proper, and she stepped to the side of the corridor and folded her hands, giving him the way. He walked past her. He said nothing. At the end of the corridor, he turned the corner and stood in the dark behind it for exactly as long as it took to locate the word that described what had just happened. The word, he determined, was unexpected. He walked on. She was a stranger with an exceptional face, and he had been surprised, which he disliked, and tomorrow she would be his wife, which he had decided long ago to be indifferent to. He told himself this clearly and walked away. He was wrong about most of it. He would not know this yet. Every protocol was observed. She walked in at the correct time, with the correct escort, wearing the correct dress. She was announced in the formal vocabulary of dynasty alliance names and territories, and the careful language of diplomatic binding, and she stood in the center of the great hall of Vaelith Castle and gave the correct deep curtsy and held it for the correct count. The hall was silent, not the designed silence of ceremony, the involuntary silence of approximately 200 people discovering simultaneously that they had not been adequately prepared. She heard the quality of it. She had heard that specific silence before, smaller versions of it, all her life. She knew what it meant. She rose from the curtsy. King Vasterin looked at her with the measured, unsurprised approval of a man who had been sent a report and now had his report confirmed. He nodded once, the single, decisive nod of a man closing a calculation. Lady Vaelith, the Vaelith dynasty welcomes you. You will be received with the full respect of your new station. Thank you, Your Majesty. Her voice was quiet. It was clear. It did not tremble or rush or overperform. It was precisely what it needed to be. She shifted her gaze correctly, the right timing, to the crown prince. He was already looking at her. His expression was closed. It was always closed. She would later understand the permanent, unbreachable closure of a man who had decided very long ago that nothing was going to get through, and had maintained this with such discipline that even he sometimes forgot there was something underneath it. But right now, in the first honest second of looking at her, directly in a room full of light, where there was no shadow to stand in and no corner to retreat around, his expression held something that was not only contempt. It was something more complicated, more uncomfortable. The expression of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit the slot he prepared for it. It lasted 2 seconds. Then it closed again, smooth and complete. Lady Vaelith, he said, not welcome, not pleased. Her name stated, a fact being filed. She gave him the correct inclination of her head. She held the dark rose. The hall exhaled. Beside Kedron, his attendant Zivith, a tall dark-skinned man with gold eyes, and the contained expression of someone very good at his job, leaned fractionally closer and murmured, barely audible, well, this will be interesting. Kedron said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved slightly. She saw it. 3 days. She had 3 days between arriving and being married. 3 days to learn which corridors went where, which maids were cautious and which were kind, which protocols were mandatory and which were performance. 3 days in a room that was objectively, materially, beyond any doubt the finest room she had ever occupied. Stone walls hung with dark tapestries, a bed with actual thick blankets, a fireplace that stayed lit through the night. She sat in it and felt the particular vertigo of someone who has lived in small rooms for so long that a large one feels like a problem to be solved. The wedding was brief. The vows were dynasty vows, not love vows, nothing so human or inconvenient as that. They were the administrative vows: duty, alliance, protection, legacy. She repeated them clearly. He repeated them in the tone of a man reading a formal decree. She had her eyes forward, so did he. When the officiant declared them bound, the custom of the Drevic dynasty required the groom to take the bride's hand. Kedron held out his hand, gloved black leather, formal. She placed her hand in it. His fingers closed around hers, not cruel, not tender, not anything that had an emotional temperature. The grip of function, the grip of a door handle. Done. The chapel produced formal applause. She held the dark rose. He released her hand in the first moment that protocol permitted and looked forward. She kept her eyes on the altar. She thought about her mother. She thought about the storage hall. She thought about the moonbeam and the night she had said, "I am not hollow." She thought, "I don't know you yet, Kedron of Drevic. I don't know what you are. I don't know what this is going to become. But I have walked into worse rooms, and I have never once let a room define me." The dawn light moved across the marble floor between them. Neither moved. In the corridor outside the chapel, Kedron spoke first. "The ceremony was efficient, quite efficient, my lord," Zivith agreed. They walked. Behind them faintly, the sound of the court filing out. She didn't flinch. He said it before he had consciously decided to say it. He heard it as it left him and was briefly, very briefly, annoyed. "No, my lord," Zivith said, in the same tone he used for all things. Measured, even, revealing nothing that hadn't been invited. "I expected." Kedron paused. Someone appropriately grateful. Appropriately overwhelmed? Yes, she was not that. She was nothing. She was entirely blank. Zivith was quiet for 2 steps. "Or very private, my lord." "That's the same thing." "With respect, my lord, it is not." Kedron looked at him. Zivith looked ahead with the serenity of a man who has made a point and does not need to repeat it. They walked on. Behind them, Vaelith stood in the corridor while the court ladies adjusted the train of her gown, and she said nothing, and she looked at nothing that anyone in the corridor could see. But once, just for the length of one breath, her eyes moved to the back of Kedron, Drevic's retreating figure, and what was in them was not hope, and not fear, and not the particular yearning of someone who needs to be seen. What was in them was the quiet, measuring, completely calm attention of someone who has just begun studying a new room. She was watching. She was learning. She had been learning since she was old enough to understand that knowledge was the only thing in this world that could not be taken from her. She was not done yet. The girl they called a ghost arrived in the coldest castle in the world. You need to understand something about Kedron Drevic. He was not born cruel. He was built that way, carefully, over decades, by a father who believed that a king who could be moved was a king who could be broken, and who had spent the better part of Kedron's childhood systematically removing from him every soft thing, every warm thing, every instinct toward tenderness, replacing each one with strategy, with control, with the particular, armored coldness of a man who has decided that feeling nothing is the same as losing nothing. Kedron had been an exceptional student. By 24, he was the most feared crown prince in the Northern Territories, not because he was violent, though he could be, not because he was merciless, though he was, but because he was precise. He read situations before they became situations. He read people before they became problems. He was always 3 steps ahead, and he had never, not once, met anyone who surprised him, until a girl in an ivory gown walked into his corridor and looked at herself in a mirror like she was checking her armor. 3 seconds. He had stood there for 3 seconds. He would spend the next several weeks punishing her for it. The morning after the wedding, she was given a schedule, not a welcome, not an introduction to the castle's people or rooms or customs. A schedule written on formal Drevic parchment in the steward's careful script, slid under her chamber door before dawn. She read it at the window in the first gray light. Princess Vaelith Drevic will take morning meals in her private chambers. She will attend formal court dinners on the first and third evening of each week. She is not required at other court functions unless summoned. Her lady's attendance will be assigned by end of week. She is not to access the West Wing. She is not to enter the war rooms or council chambers. She is not to speak in council sessions if present. Not required. Not to access. Not to speak. She folded the schedule neatly and set it on the windowsill. She was summoned to his receiving room at mid-morning. He did not look up when she entered. He continued reading his documents for approximately 30 seconds after she arrived, not the 30 seconds of a man who had not heard her come in, but the deliberate 30 seconds of a man communicating something. And then he set his pen down and looked at her with the expression he would come to use for her consistently, clear, flat, slightly impatient, as though she were a matter to be resolved. Your duties in this castle are limited, he said. You will attend the formal dinners. You will be present at the 2 annual court ceremonies. You will not speak on political matters. You will not form alliances within the court without my approval. You will not speak in council sessions, she finished quietly. Yes, I read the schedule. A pause, brief. She saw the slight change in his eyes, the rapid recalibration of a man who expected the sentence to end differently. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. I understand you perfectly, my lord. Not yes, not of course, not the soft performance of submission. I understand you perfectly. It was not defiant. It was not sarcastic. It was a statement so cleanly neutral that he could not technically object to it. He looked at her for 2 seconds. You are dismissed, he said. She gave the correct inclination of her head and left. In the corridor, Vaelith fell into step beside her. He had been waiting outside and said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, the castle can be difficult to navigate at first. If you need anything, Lady Vaelith, I am. Which corridor leads to the gardens? She asked. He blinked. Then he told her. She went to the gardens, and she stood in the cold gray morning air, and she looked at the black stone walls around her and the dark winter stripped hedgerows, and the sky above that was the same, heavy gray as everything else in this place. And she thought, this is a harder room than I've had before, but I have studied harder rooms. She breathed in 4 counts, hold, begin. The Drevic court did not need to be told. This was the thing about courts, the truly sophisticated ones, the ones that had been operating for centuries around the same kind of power, with the same kind of prince at the center. They read the temperature. They read the micro-signals, who was seated where, who was spoken to, who was dismissed. They took their cues the way a murmuration of birds takes direction from something invisible, collectively and instantly. Kedron had not said, exclude her. He had not said, she is not important. He had not arranged the seating or distributed instructions. He had simply, at the first formal dinner, not spoken to her, had not looked toward her end of the table, had not, when making the general table remarks that a prince makes at his own court dinner, included or addressed her in any way. And the court had understood. Vaelith sat in the gap they left around her and ate her dinner. The food was extraordinary. She noted this with the removed appreciation of someone who had eaten laundry room scraps for most of her childhood. Whatever else this place was, it ate well. She catalogued the court while she ate. The woman with the white blonde hair 3 seats down, Lady the Severn, by the crest on her ring, kept looking at Vaelith with the very specific expression of a woman who has decided someone is not a threat and is pleased about this. That was useful information. The older lord beside Kedron, heavily built, gray-streaked beard, watching everything that was Duke Hever. She would learn later. He watched her the way a chess player watches a new piece on a board he thought he had solved. The 2 young court ladies with their heads together, Liz and Oren, she would learn their names, were the ones who would carry what they saw tonight back to everyone else's ears by morning. She filed this. You're staring, the lady to her left said, not unkindly. This was Drisson, assigned as one of her ladies, young, cautious, the only one at the table who had not moved her chair the necessary half-inch away. I'm learning faces, Vaelith said. Drisson blinked. For what? Vaelith considered. Because knowing who people are is the only advantage available to me at the moment. Drisson looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her own goblet and, looked very carefully. At the other end of the table, Duke Hever, she said quietly. He's the one you want to understand first. He's been the prince's advisor since before I was born, and he's never trusted anyone he couldn't predict. And the prince? Can he predict the prince? Drissen was quiet for exactly the right amount of time. No one can, she said. Not even Zivith, not even himself. Some days. Vaelith looked at Kedron's profile at the other end of the table. He was looking at his wine, somewhere else entirely. She turned back to her dinner. Start with Hever, she thought. Work outward. They came for her in stages. Lady Liss was first, which was appropriate, since she was the fastest and the most practiced. She had been at Drevik court since she was 16, and she had, in that time, developed a social cruelty so refined it barely looked like cruelty at all. It looked like smiling. It looked like forgetting. It looked like the specific, sparkling friendliness of someone who knows they are being watched. The first encounter in the corridor, she had not moved to let Vaelith pass, which in the physical grammar of court spoke clearly was, accompanied by the smile and the words, "We keep forgetting you're here. You're so quiet, like a little shadow." The ladies with her had laughed lightly, as ladies do. Vaelith looked at Liss for exactly long enough. Then she said, "How strange. I never forget that I'm here, but thank you for noticing." She walked forward. Liss and something in Liss's face stuttered, very briefly. At the complete and utter lack of wound stepped aside. Fractionally, without quite meaning to, Vaelith passed through. Behind her, she heard the ladies regroup. "I can't tell if she's very stupid or very..." "She's strange," Liss said, with the clipped precision of someone ending a conversation they didn't win. "She's strange and she won't last a month." Vaelith kept walking. She had heard that specific sentence before, rephrased only slightly. From Thessaly, from Velara, from every version of polished contempt she had ever encountered. She had outlasted all of them. She would outlast this. The encounters accumulated over days, over the first week. The left-out conversation, the letter not delivered, the chair moved just slightly too far, the door that was closed a beat before she reached it. None of it dramatic, all of it deliberate. She catalogued each one. She did not respond. She watched, she studied, and every night, when the castle had gone quiet, she found the one space Drevik Castle offered that no one had thought to forbid her. The eastern tower, the stairs that went up, the open-air platform at the top, where the cold wind came in from the mountains like something alive. She went there because no one else did. It was too cold, too far, too inconvenient for courtiers with elaborate hair and delicate slippers. She went there in her plain gown with her hair loose, and she looked at the mountains and the dark sky and the cold black stars, and she breathed. And some nights, when the wind was right and the platform was wide enough, she moved, just slightly, just the edges of dancing, not the full thing, not yet, not here. But the impulse remained, the need to take what she felt and transform it into something her body could release. She was waiting for the right room. Zivith brought the report on the third evening of the second week. He set it on the desk with the same exactness he brought to all things and waited. Kedron read it. The report was from the court's information network, a system Kedron had built himself over 6 years. Because information was power and he intended to hold all of it. It covered social dynamics, alliances forming and dissolving, anything that required his attention. It noted, in Zivith's careful hand, the following: Lady Liss and her companions have made several attempts to isolate the princess. The princess has not responded in any way that could be categorized as distressed. She has been seen in conversation with Steward Rovin, with Duke Hever's secretary, and with Lady Drissen on 6 separate occasions. She appears to be building a map of the court. She reads in the Eastern Library each morning for 2 hours. She is never late to the formal dinners. She has not once, in 14 days, been found crying, complaining, or seeking comfort from any party. Kedron read this section twice. Then he read it a third time. He set the report down. He looked at the fire. He thought, against his own better judgment, about the corridor. About the 3 seconds. About the expression that was not the expression of someone grateful, someone overwhelmed, someone performing. She's mapping the court, he thought. She's been here 2 weeks and she's building a map. He thought about who that was. What kind of person did that? What kind of life produced a person who arrived in a completely hostile environment and responded by quietly, systematically understanding it? He did not allow this thought to arrive at a destination. He picked up the report and set it in the fire and watched it go. Is there anything else? He said. No, my lord, Vaelith said. He looked at the empty chair across from him. He did not know why he was looking at it. He looked back at the fire. That will be all, he said. Vaelith left. The room was quiet. The fire burned, and the quality of the quiet, Kedron noticed and immediately disliked noticing, had a specific shape to it. The shape of something missing, something that had not been there before and was now notable in its absence. He reached for his glass. Stop noticing things, he told himself. He was not, that night, particularly successful. She mapped the court in 3 weeks. Not a physical map, though she did, on the inside back cover of her book, develop a system of notation that would have been incomprehensible to anyone else but was perfectly clear to her. Arrows for allegiance direction, circles for primary influence, a small cross for anyone who had demonstrated they could be trusted, and a small horizontal line for anyone who could not. She understood Drevic court by the end of the 3rd week the way a surgeon understands a body, not just the surface, but the system underneath. Who controlled what? Who wanted what? Where the tensions were, where the loyalties ran shallow and where they ran deep. Drissen, who had been installed as her lady's attendant, with the obvious expectation that she would be a quiet, undemanding assignment, found herself instead in the unexpected position of being systematically interviewed. Why does Duke Hever attend every council session but leave early? How long has Lady Liz been at court? Who brought her here? What happened to the prince's last political engagement? Why was it dissolved? Drissen answered everything, because Vaelith asked with the precise, genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand rather than the probing, angled curiosity of someone building ammunition. And it turned out these were very different feelings to be on the receiving end of. You're not what I expected, Drissen said one afternoon. What did you expect? Drissen considered this with honest effort. Someone who needed protecting, I think. Vaelith smiled. It was small and a little sad and absolutely real. The first completely real smile she had allowed herself in this castle. I've been protecting myself since I was 7, she said. I don't need more practice. What I need is information. Drissen looked at her for a long moment. Then I'll tell you everything I know, she said simply. And she did. Armed with Drissen's knowledge and her own 3 weeks of observation, Vaelith began carefully, quietly, with the patience of someone who understood that fast moves in hostile territory were how you got her to move. She exchanged a letter with Duke Hever's secretary, formal, correct, about library access, but worded in a way that demonstrated she understood the library's catalog and the value of particular historical texts to someone with Hever's specific scholarly interests. 3 days later, Hever himself came to the Eastern Library. He found her there, reading. He sat across from her. The 3rd volume of Drevic's founding treatise, he said, as an opener, nodding at the book in her hands. Unusual reading for a new arrival. I find it useful to understand the legal architecture of where I live, she said. His eyebrows, impressively heavy for a vampire, rose slightly. Most of the court does not read founding treaties. Most of the court, she said, is not me. He looked at her for a long, then he sat back and almost not quite smiled. No, he said, it is not. The court map had its first ally. Small, careful, true. On the 19th day, she was left off the seating list. Not a mistake. The functionary's flat, rehearsed tone had made that plain. Someone had requested the amendment. The list had been updated. She stood in the corridor and held the card and breathed. In 4 counts, hold. She returned to her chambers. She ate her dinner alone at the small table. by the window and watched the courtyard below fill with the arriving guests. For the reception she was not attending, and she thought, I have sat at tables where I was not welcome before. I have eaten in rooms below stairs for 19 years. This is not new, but it stung. She allowed it to sting for exactly the length of her dinner. Then she cleared the sting away and opened her book. She did not know that Vaelith had seen her in the corridor. She did not know that Vaelith, who had served Kedron for 8 years and had never once, in all that time, commented on his lord's personal decisions, knocked on the door of Kedron's private receiving room that evening and said, when invited in, My lord, the princess was removed from tonight's seating list. Kedron looked up from his correspondence. Yes, you authorized it? A brief silence. I don't require explanation for my court management decisions, Vaelith. No, my lord. Vaelith did not move. Is there something else? Vaelith looked at the middle distance for a moment, the considered pause of a man choosing words with care. She stood in the corridor for approximately 3 seconds, he said, and then she went back to her chambers. She did not ask anyone for help. She did not make a scene. She ate her dinner alone. Yes? I observed her face in that 3-second period, my lord. Kedron set down his pen. And she was not broken by it. Vaelith paused again. She was hurt by it. There is a difference. The room was quiet. Kedron looked at his correspondence. She is a political arrangement, he said. She is not my responsibility in the way you are implying. Of course, my lord, that will be all. Vaelith left. Kedron did not pick up his pen for another 4 minutes. He sat and looked at the fireplace and thought about the word Vaelith had used. Hurt. He thought about his own father, who had spent 30 years systematically ensuring that Kedron could not be hurt by anything, who had considered this a gift. He thought about the corridor, the 3 seconds. He picked up his pen. He signed the next document. He did not restore her to the seating list, but the document after that, the monthly chamber allowance review, he paused over. He added, Lady Vaelith Drevik's wardrobe, allowance to be reviewed and supplemented by the Royal Household Fund, arranged with the castle seamstresses immediately. He did not tell anyone why. He did not entirely know why. He signed it and moved on. She did not know who had ordered it. The seamstress, a small, precise woman called Wren, who communicated, mostly in pins and measurements, arrived at her chambers one morning with 3 assistants and an armful of fabric, and informed her that her wardrobe was to be amended by royal household order. Vaelith stood in the middle of her chamber and watched fabric unroll onto her bed in colors. She had never worn deep midnight blue, dark wine red, a green so dark it was almost black, and felt something she could not entirely categorize. She tried on the midnight blue first. When she turned to the mirror, the expression that crossed her face was brief and very private, and she did not allow it to stay there long. But Drisson saw it. It was not vanity. It was not triumph. It was the expression of a girl who had worn gray her entire life, who had been dressed in the visual language of you are less than, you are below, you are not worth color, looking at herself in something that said, quietly and with conviction, you are not nothing. She touched the embroidery at her sleeve. It suits you, Drisson said softly. It's just a dress, Vaelith said. Yes, Drisson agreed. The way a sword is just metal. Vaelith looked at her in the mirror. Then she did something she hadn't done properly since before she left Drevhall Estate. She laughed, a real one, short, surprised, startled out of her. The kind of laugh that happens when something catches you before you can manage it. Drisson's face lit up like a window being opened. There she is, Drisson said, very quietly. There she actually is. Vaelith pressed her lips together and looked back at the mirror, but the laugh had happened, and something behind her eyes was slightly less defended for a few minutes afterward. She did not discover who had ordered the dresses until a week later, when she overheard the stewards in the corridor discussing household accounts. She paused outside the door. She listened. She walked back to her chambers with an expression that Drisson, meeting her at the door, described later as unreadable but very, very busy. She wore the midnight blue to the monthly court gathering, This was the first court event she had attended with something other than the gray, and the effect was not dramatic in the way of stories, not a gasp that silenced the room. It was subtler and therefore more lasting. People noticed, not just her face, which they had already noticed, and had been discussing for 3 weeks in the careful, sidelong way of people who discuss things they don't quite have words for. They noticed her in the dress, at Duke Hever's side, in actual conversation, and this combination, somehow, was the thing that changed the temperature. Because Hever was not a man who spent time in conversation with people he found uninteresting. He was known for this. He had left dinners early to avoid tedium, had been famously blunt to 3 visiting ambassadors who attempted to engage him in what he called performative discourse, had once walked out of a council session because the discussion was, in his words, below the level of productive thought. He was standing at Vaelith's side, and he was engaged, leaning slightly, responding, the body language, to anyone who knew him, of a man who had found something worth his time. The Fourth Amendment to the Northern Territory Charter actually contradicts the founding treaty on precisely the point Vasterin is relying on, Vaelith was saying quietly, when Kedron's eyes found her, which means the legal basis for the boundary claim is structurally weaker than his advisors appear to believe. Hever was looking at her the way certain people look at certain things when they discover they are not the only one who has seen them. Who told you this? No one, she said. I read the original charter. Across the room, Kedron's eyes stayed on her for 6 seconds. Not 3, 6. One of the lords beside him said something. He did not hear it. My lord? What? He turned back. Yes, continue. But the lord had noticed the pause. The lords always noticed. Later, much later, when the gathering had dissolved and the hall emptied, Kedron stood at the window of his own study and looked at the dark courtyard below and thought about the thing that was, by now, becoming a persistent and inconvenient pattern. Every time he decided she was manageable, predictable, slotted, easy to not think about, she did something that adjusted the category. He did not like having his categories adjusted. She is reading founding charters, he thought. She is advising Hever. She is wearing midnight blue and speaking about treaty law, and she looks. He stopped the sentence before it reached its noun. He closed the shutters. He went to bed. He did not sleep easily. The thing about Kedron's cruelty was that it was never direct. He never said anything to her that could be pointed to. He never raised his voice, never insulted her, never employed the blunt instruments that crueler people used. He was precise in the way all his father had taught him to be. His damage was architectural, not individual. He built the conditions in which damage happened, and then he was elsewhere. When it arrived, his silence was the permission. She understood this. She had grown up in a house built on the same principle. A father whose guilty absence gave shape to everything that followed. A stepmother whose for words established a structure that all the cruelties of all the years were simply the natural furniture of. She knew what this was. Knowing did not make it painless. There was a specific quality to being made invisible by someone who is choosing to make you invisible, someone who could choose otherwise, who has the power to choose otherwise, and every single day selects the same direction. It had a different ache to it than the contempt of people who had never once considered you worth their consideration. This was active. This required ongoing effort. She thought about this in the corridor after he had walked past, his footsteps fading, Lys's voice dissolving around the corner. She thought about the dress he had ordered, the wardrobe he had amended without explanation. She thought about the look across the room at the court gathering. She thought about a man who had looked at her for 6 seconds from across a hall and then closed his shutters against whatever the looking meant. You're frightened of something, she thought, not with anger, with the clinical precision of the girl who had spent her life reading hostile environments. You are frightened of something, and you are managing the fear badly, and I am the nearest available surface for the management. She looked at the empty corridor. She breathed. I have been someone else's fear before. I have been someone else's inconvenience, someone else's shame, someone else's problem. I have been every category of unwanted. I am not going to be undone by yours. She walked on, but that night, in her chambers, she sat by the fire and allowed herself something she rarely did. Something that was not strategy, not cataloging, not breathing through the counting. She let herself be simply, honestly tired. Tired of being managed. Tired of being moved from one cold house to another. Tired of the quiet, specific cruelty of people who needed someone small to feel large. She pressed her mother's ring against her lips. Mama, she thought, how long? The fire gave no answer, but somewhere, very deep in the part of her that had been building something slow and patient for 19 years, something shifted, not breaking, building towards something. He had not meant to be in that corridor. He rarely told himself the truth about the things he had not meant to order the dresses, had not meant to stand for 6 seconds across the hall, had not meant to sign the wardrobe amendment, had not meant to take the east corridor rather than his usual route, had not meant to hear the sound, music, except it wasn't music. There was no instrument. What he heard was rhythm movement, something that his body registered before his mind had processed it, a sound that wasn't quite sound, a feeling in the air of a space being used for something. It had been waiting a long time to be used for. He followed it. He found the East Hall. He stopped in the arch of the entrance. She was dancing. He had been in the presence of beauty his entire life. He was a Drevik. It was the currency of his world. He had seen court performances, professional dancers from the eastern cities, elaborate displays staged for diplomatic occasions. He knew what trained beauty looked like in motion. This was not that. This was something he had no architecture to receive. She was not performing. She had no idea he was there. Her eyes were closed, her face entirely open. Every guarded layer that she wore in the daylight hours stripped away in this room, in this moonlight, in this dance that was not for anyone but her. He watched her grief in it. He could read it, somehow, the way you read weather. He watched years of endurance in the arc of her arm. He watched something like freedom in the extension of her spine. He watched her, and for the first time in a very long time, in as long as he could accurately remember, he did not think. He did not calculate. He did not read the situation or assess the variable or prepare the response. He simply stood in the dark and watched a girl dance in moonlight. And somewhere in the chest of a man who had spent 24 years being systematically emptied of soft things, something cracked, not broke, cracked, the way ice cracks in spring, the slow, massive, irreversible announcement of a change in season. She turned mid-dance and stopped. She had sensed something, some instinct, sharpened by years of needing to know when she was not alone. She went very still in the moonbeam and looked toward the arch. She could see only shadow. "Who is there?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. He should have said nothing. He should have moved back, left, been gone before she could confirm it. He was very good at absence. It was one of his primary tools. He stepped forward out of the shadow, into the edge of the moonlight. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had been crying. He hadn't realized this until now, the specific brightness of eyes that have been crying and have not been wiped yet. Her hair was wild around her. Her nightgown was plain and her feet were bare on the cold stone. She looked, here was the word his mind produced. Before he could stop it, she looked like herself, more completely herself than he had seen her in any formal context, in any gown, in any corridor or hall or dinner. This was the unguarded thing, and he had been allowed to see it. He watched the layers come back, watched her composure return, slowly, like ice reforming on water, not fast, because he had caught her genuinely off guard, but certain. She straightened, her face closed. "My lord," she said, with all the formal correctness of the dinner table. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't sure what he meant by it. "Don't perform, don't close, don't lock the thing I just saw away as if it didn't happen." He didn't have the vocabulary for what he meant, because vocabulary required preparation and he had none. She held his gaze. "How long were you standing there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. She looked at him for a long, clear, measuring moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Then you saw something no one has ever seen." "I know. What are you going to do with it?" He had no answer. He had absolutely no answer. He stood in the moonlit hall of his own castle, looking at a girl he had spent 5 weeks treating like a necessary inconvenience. And he had no answer. "I don't know," he said. And that admission from a man who had answers for everything, who had built his entire identity on always having answers, was the thing that undid her composure completely. Not the beautiful dress, not the wardrobe amendment, not 6 seconds across a hall. "I don't know." She looked at him and saw it. The crack, the tiny, massive fracture in the glacier. She did not smile. She did not soften or step toward him or give him anything that felt like reward. But something changed in her eyes. From watching an enemy to watching a person. "Go to sleep, my lord," she said, very softly. "We cannot know things better in the morning." She picked up the thin shawl she had left on a stone ledge, wrapped it around her shoulders, and walked past him and out of the hall. He stood in the moonbeam for a long time after she left. She was in the library when he arrived. She looked up and looked down and said nothing. He sat 2 chairs from her, without explaining why he had chosen those seats or this room or this hour. This room he had not used in approximately 4 months, that she had been using every morning for 5 weeks. He opened his book. She continued writing. The silence between them was an entirely new kind. She could feel the difference in it the way you can feel the difference in temperature between 2 adjacent rooms. This silence was not the deliberate silence of a man communicating dismissal. It was not the formal silence of protocol. It had the specific quality of 2 people who have seen something of each other and are now in the process of renegotiating what they are to each other, carefully, without speaking, without yet being willing to say what they are doing. She wrote 3 sentences and then stopped and stared at the page. He read approximately 2 paragraphs and then stopped and stared at the page. Neither acknowledged staring at their respective pages. After approximately 10 minutes, he said, without looking up, "The 3rd volume. Heather mentioned you had read it." "Yes," she said. "The 4th Charter Amendment. It contradicts the founding treaty on the boundary claim." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it does. My advisors have not mentioned this." "I noticed." Another pause, longer. "How long have you known that?" 3 weeks, she said. He set down his book. He looked at her openly, properly, without the filter of management or assessment. Just looked. "You've been sitting on that for 3 weeks. I didn't know what to do with it," she said, carefully. "I wasn't sure whether to tell you. I wasn't sure," she paused. "I wasn't sure whether you would want information from me." The sentence landed in the room with the quiet precision of something that contained more than its words. He heard it. "I should have told you," he said. It was not an apology. He did not do apologies. It was something more precise than that. An acknowledgement of a specific, individual error of judgment, given by a man who did not do that either. She looked at him. "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." And then, to give him somewhere to go from that. "The full structural argument is written in my notes if you want it. It would take approximately 40 minutes to present properly." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for his pen. "I have 40 minutes. She turned to a clean page. And for the first time since she had arrived at Drevik Castle, they sat in the same room and did something together. Not performing, not managing, not enduring. Together. The document was left where she would find it. She understood this immediately. Its placement was too deliberate, too precisely in her path, the corridor she used at the hour she used it. It had been arranged. She picked it up and read it. It was a copy of an internal correspondence. She would learn later that it had been taken from the archive room, that only 3 people had access to the archive at that level. That Liz was the secretary to one of them. The letter was between Veldrick Ashmore and King Vastran Drevik, written 14 months ago, before the peace negotiations, before any of the language about alliances and arrangements and political utility. It was a debt letter, Valdric had made a financial agreement with the Drevic dynasty, a significant one, involving territorial concessions and trade rights, and had defaulted onto years of payment. The letter confirmed the terms of repayment. In lieu of the outstanding amount, Lord Valdric Ashmore will provide, upon request, one daughter of his blood in formal marriage to the Drevic crown. Said daughter to require no dowry, no settlement, and no political complication. It is understood that this daughter will be of non-primary status within the Ashmore household. Non-primary status, the language of a contract, the language of an item being transferred, not an alliance, not a peace accord, not any of the careful, dignified vocabulary that had been used in her presence since the beginning. A debt. She was a debt. She had been the cheapest available option. The daughter who would come with nothing, ask for nothing, cause no political difficulty because she had no political standing to begin with. The beauty that the delegate had noticed and reported had simply been the convenient justification for which daughter to send. She stood in the corridor and the document shook slightly in her hands, not much, but some, enough. She thought about Zivith. She thought about the library. She thought about 2 chairs down on the same side, and the 40 minutes in which something new had been built carefully, uncertainly, with the fragility of first things. She thought about his face in the moonlit hall. I don't know. She folded the document. She walked back to her chambers. She sat down. She did not dance. She did not breathe to for counts. She sat with it, just sat with the raw, unmanaged weight of it and let it be exactly what it was. And then, when she had sat with it long enough to know its true shape, she made a decision. She was going to find out what he knew, not as a confrontation. She needed the truth of his knowledge, whether he had known the terms, whether the marriage had been, for him, what it had been for her, a transaction in the language of convenient disposal, or whether he had also been managed by his father, moved into position, a piece in the same game from a different direction. She needed to know, because what she did next depended entirely on the answer. She had found him in the library. He had been there an hour already, which had become a pattern neither of them discussed. Both of them had noticed. She walked in and set the document on the table in front of him and said, I need to know if you knew. He looked at her. Then he looked at the document. He read it. This was the test not of the document, but of him. She was reading his face with the attention she had applied to hostile environments all her life, and for once she was not looking for threat. She was looking for truth. The movement in his face was very small. He was surprised, not performing surprise, genuinely, involuntarily surprised. He set the document down. I didn't know, he said. She breathed. The negotiations were presented to me as a peace arrangement. I was given the political vocabulary alliance, mutual benefit, territorial stability. I was not given the original correspondence. Your father knew. Yes. A silence. We were both moved, she said. Yes. You into an unwanted marriage, and you into a debt settlement. She nodded. The fire burned between them. The night outside the library window was very dark and very quiet and very cold, the way nights in this part of the territory were always cold, deep into winter. I have treated you, he said carefully, as if you chose to be here, as if your presence were a political imposition that you were responsible for. She waited. You didn't choose this. No, she said. I was handed over at dinner, between the second and third course. No one asked me. He looked at her. Something in his face did what it had done in the moonlit hall, cracked slightly. The glacier again. I owe you. Don't apologize, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. Not yet. First, I need to know what you're going to do about it. He looked at her for a long moment. About what, specifically? Your father used me as a commodity. My father sold me to settle a debt. The court that takes its cues from you has spent 5 weeks making me invisible. She paused. What are you going to do? The question sat in the room. He looked at the document. He looked at the fire. He looked at her, at the girl in the midnight blue with the straight black hair and the dark eyes that had never once, not once in his observation, been asking for anything except to be seen as a person. Something, he said. I'm going to do something. It was the second time he had given her an honest answer instead of a prepared one. She looked at him for a long, clear moment. Then she sat down in the chair across from him, and she put her hands on the table, and she said, "Then tell me what you know about the boundary territories. Tell me all of it. If your father has been playing a longer game than either of us understood, I want to know what board we're actually on." He sat down. He told her. They talked until the fire burned low. He brought her into the council chamber. The room received this information in stages, the advisors finding their seats and then discovering her already there. The various degrees of frozen shock moving across faces that were professionally trained to reveal nothing and were losing that battle slightly. Hever sat and looked at her and then at Kedron, with a fractional widening of the eyes that constituted for Hever considerable surprise. King Vasterin arrived last. He took his seat. He looked at his son. The look contained an entire conversation, a conversation they had been building toward for several years, about succession and control, and the specific moment when a king's management of his heir becomes his heir's management of him. Kedron held his father's gaze. Princess Vaelith will be present at council sessions, he said, permanently. Her knowledge of the founding treaty and the Fourth Charter Amendment is directly relevant to the boundary territorial discussions. She will be treated as an active participant. Vasterin's voice, when it came, was controlled. The council protocols do not. I am amending them, Kedron said. Now, more silence. This one had a different texture, not shock, but the suspended moment of a room, watching two forces test their weight against each other, trying to determine which one will hold. Vaelith kept her hands flat on the table. She looked at the map before her. She did not look at Kedron. She had been told what was going to happen. They had planned this. Last night, over the dying fire, voices low and careful, the specific collaboration of two people who have decided to stop being managed and start managing. The Fourth Charter Amendment, she said, into the silence, with the clear, even tone of someone who has been speaking at difficult tables their whole life and has decided today is not a day to perform. Uncertainty creates a structural problem in the legal basis of the northern boundary claim that the Ashmore estate is currently using against the Drevic territory. If your advisors pursue the current strategy, you will lose in the formal tribunal. I have the argument in full. The room was absolutely silent. Hever said, very quietly, present it. She presented it. For 22 minutes, she laid out the treaty argument clearly, precisely, without notes, to a room full of the most powerful vampires in the Northern Territory, most of whom had spent the past 5 weeks looking through her. When she finished, the room was still. Then Hever said, she's right. Then 3 other advisors concurred. Vasterin looked at his son. This was not, Vaelith knew, the end of that particular conflict. The look between them said that clearly. The power struggle between king and heir had been moved, by this morning, into its active phase. What happened next would take months to resolve. But today, in this room the board had shifted. She had been a piece in a game. She had just become a player. It was Drissin who told her about the vault. Not intentionally, it had come out sideways during one of their conversations about castle history. A sentence half finished about the old rooms below the east wing, the ones the king doesn't show to anyone, the ones they say were here before the castle was built. Vaelith had been quiet for a moment. Then, show me. She had expected Drissin to refuse. Drissin surprised her. The vault was real. The runes were real, old in the way that made the founding treaties in the library look like recent correspondence. The carvings were in a script she did not recognize and somehow, when she stood in the room, could almost not quite read. Almost. The basin drew her. She did not decide to put her hand over it. Her body moved before her mind did. The same instinct that had moved her into dancing when she was 12. The same deep knowing that her body carried. and her mind sometimes caught up with later. The liquid rose. The light traveled up her arm. She looked at it. She was not afraid. She was curious. And then, as the light reached her elbow and she could feel it, warm and immense and entirely unlike anything she had known before. She was something else, something she didn't have a word for, something that felt, somehow, like the inside of the room she had built in herself all those years. The room full of everything she had survived and never said. The room that was so full now. The light looked like that room, she thought, warm and dark and absolutely hers. Vaelith, Kedron's voice from the doorway. She looked at him over her shoulder. He was looking at the light on her arm with the expression of a man who has just had an equation solved that he had been working on for a long time. "What is this?" she asked. He crossed the vault slowly, carefully, as if the room required that. He stopped beside her. He looked at the basin, the light, her arm. "My great-grandmother discovered it," he said. "This vault, these runes. The basin is called Vaelith's well in the old dynasty records." She looked at him. "Vaelith," she said. "The old word for it means something like the true blood vessel. The old magic records say that the basin responds to someone who carries." He paused. "The dynasty histories call it the sleeping flame, a bloodline power that passes through firstborn Drevic blood. It has not activated in 80 years. My father spent 40 years in this vault and it never." He stopped. They both looked at her arm, at the light moving through her veins like a second blood. "I'm half-blood," she said. "Your father is Valdric Ashmore, who is the last legitimate heir of the Drevic Eastern line," Kedron said. "A distant branch. It was severed from the dynasty records 200 years ago over a succession dispute." Silence. Vaelith, his voice had changed. Something in it she had not heard before. "You are not just an Ashmore. You are technically, legally, by blood a Drevic." She looked at the light on her arm. The light pulsed once warm, deep, absolutely certain. She thought about the founding treaty, the legal architecture, the debt letter, the council chamber this morning, the entire structure of the game that had been played around her, with her as the piece being moved. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Then they didn't just sell me to the Drevic dynasty, did they?" "No," he said. "They sold me back to myself." The basin pulsed silver. The light on her arm burned gold. The meeting with Vasterin was not a confrontation. It was a declaration. Kedron had requested it formally, the exact protocol, the correct hour, the official channel. Nothing that could be characterized as emotional or impulsive. Everything that could be characterized as a crown prince who had done his preparation. She stood beside him. Vasterin looked at them both for a long time. "The vault," he said finally. Not a question. "Yes," Kedron said. "You found it." She found it. He did not look at her when he said this, but something in the way he said she just a slight difference in weight. The way you say a name rather than a pronoun was notable. Vaelith's well responded to her. "The dormant flame. The records are clear about what that means. The records are old. They are also accurate. You know they are accurate. You spent 40 years in that vault hoping they were accurate for you." Silence. Vasterin looked at Vaelith. She met his gaze. She had been meeting gazes all her life. She was not going to stop now. "You knew," she said. Not accusatory, just clear. "About the Drevic Eastern line. About Ashmore's bloodline. You knew when you requested me specifically." "I suspected," the king said. "You used me. I used the situation. Differently framed. Same result." Vasterin looked at his son. "She speaks plainly. It's one of her more useful qualities," Kedron said. "This is not the marriage I arranged." "No," Kedron said. "It's better. For the dynasty." A pause. "For us." The word us sat in the room. Vasterin looked at his son, and in his face was the specific expression of a king confronting the thing he had both wanted and feared. An heir who had finally, completely, become someone he could not manage. He looked at Vaelith one more time. "The Eastern bloodline," he said, more quietly. "Your power the well responded to you. It will need to be trained." "I'm accustomed to teaching myself," she said. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he sat back. Yes, he said. I imagine you are. She did not plan the confrontation. It grew from a decision she made while standing at her chamber window on a cold afternoon, watching the courtyard below and thinking about what her mother had said all those years ago in the warm laundry room. You wait for the day their smallness is no longer your problem. She had the information. She had Drizin's account, Hever's confirmation, the archive record that traced the document to Lys's access. She had the complete chain. She had Kedron. Not as a protector, she had not asked for protection. She did not need the particular rescue of a powerful man standing between her and something, but as the person who had, the night before, said simply, "What do you need?" and meant it in the way of someone who was asking about her, specifically, not about what management of the situation would look like. I need to handle it myself, she had said. All right, but I need the court to be present. He had looked at her. All right, he said again. He had arranged the court gathering. She had not raised her voice in the hall. She stood in the center of the black marble floor and she spoke clearly, conversationally, with the same precision she had applied to the treaty argument. Only this time the subject was not legal text but a chain of deliberate social harm, laid out from beginning to end with every piece named, the document left for her to find, the seating list, the corridor, the years of it, and yes, she named the years. She named Drevhull Estate and her father's court, because context mattered, and the context was that she had been made small her entire life, and she was naming that too, here, in front of all of them, not crying, not shaking, just naming. I am not going to be invisible, she said at the end, not to Lys specifically, to the room, not in this castle, not in this court, not to any of you. I am not a debt. I am not an arrangement. I am not a convenient face that was sent here to be quiet and grateful and managed. The hall was silent. I am Vaelith of the Drevic Eastern bloodline, and I have read every foundational document of this dynasty, and I know the Fourth Charter Amendment, and I have stood in Vaelith's well, and I am more correctly placed in this court than most of you who have been here for a century. A long silence. Then Duke Hever, from his position near the wall, said, "Well, quite." Two other lords concurred. Lys stood near the wall with her social armor stripped off by the simple force of facts being read aloud, and she looked like someone who had not anticipated this kind of quiet. Vaelith looked at her for a moment. "I don't want your punishment," she said. "I want you to understand what you did. You can do with that what you choose." She turned. Kedron was watching her from the edge of the hall. She met his eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. The expression on his face, that careful, fractured, open expression that she had been watching develop over weeks, that had been cracking through the glacier one layer at a time, was more than sufficient. She walked toward the door. She had gone to the tower to breathe, not to think. She had done enough thinking for one day, a whole structure of it, layer after layer, from the vault to the council chamber to the hall, and her mind needed somewhere without walls for a while. The wind at the top of the tower was ferocious and entirely impersonal. It was not cruel. It was not strategic. It had no agenda for her. She stood in it and let it do what wind does and felt. Slowly, the day began to leave her body. She heard his footsteps on the stairs behind her. She did not turn. She knew his footsteps now. This was the kind of thing you learned about someone when you started paying attention, not as an exercise in reading a hostile environment, but as the particular, involuntary attention of someone who has started to care what direction a person is coming from. She cared. She had been caring for some time and had been very carefully not examining it. He stopped behind her, not at the arch, close. The wind moved between them. "You didn't need me today," he said eventually. "In the hall." "No," she agreed. "I know. Then why mention it?" A pause. "Because there's a difference," he said, "between being present for someone and being used by them, and I wanted you to know I was there as the former, not the latter." She thought about that. "No one has made that distinction for me before," she said. "I know. You don't know. I read your history," he said quietly. Before you came here, the household records from Drevhull, the staff reports, what your life was. She was quiet. I knew before you arrived, he said, what you had been. I read it and He stopped. She waited. I dismissed it, he said, because it was easier, because I had already decided what you were going to be in this place, and the truth of what you'd survived was an inconvenience to that decision. The wind moved. Her hands on the parapet were cold. Kedrin. It was the first time she had used his name without title. Just the name. Just him. Yes. Look at the mountains. He turned. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. They stood in the same wind, looking at the same vast, ancient, indifferent dark. I don't know how to do this, he said, quiet, honest, the third honest thing he had given her. They were accumulating slowly, these honest things, like careful deposits into something fragile that was becoming, incrementally, something that could hold weight. Do what? Whatever this is. She thought about her mother in the laundry room, about warmth that was temporary and should be held, about the cracked silver ring against her palm. I don't think you do it, she said. I think you just stay. I think you stay and you keep being honest and you stop managing whatever you feel about it. His hand moved on the parapet, not reaching, not performative, his hand moving until it rested beside hers, the barest margin of cold stone between them, not yet touching, not yet, but present, deliberate, a choice. She looked at the mountains. He looked at the mountains. I can do that, he said. I know you can, she said. The wind came up from the valleys below, vast and cold and clean, and carried them both equally. She set up the candles herself. Drissen found her doing it in the late afternoon, and had simply picked up a candle and started lighting without asking, which was one of the things Vaelith had come to love about Drissen. She operated on the principle that the correct response to someone doing something important was to help, not to ask why. Are you sure? Drissen asked as she placed the last one. No, Vaelith said, but I'm doing it anyway. She had told Kedrin the East Hall that evening, an hour after dinner. She had told him without explanation, and he had looked at her for a moment and then simply nodded. He was there when she arrived, already seated on the floor, back against the wall, exactly where she had imagined him. No book, no document, no armor of productivity, just present. She had stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. Then she had walked to the center of the floor, to the intersection of moonlight and candlelight, and she had begun. This dance was different from all the ones before. All the previous dances had been between her and the room, her grief and the stone, her endurance and the dark. They had been private in the complete sense of that word, fully interior, fully hers, the body doing what the heart could not afford to do in daylight. This one was between her and the room and him. She was not performing. She was absolutely clear on this. This was not performance. It had never been performance. It could not be without ceasing to be what it was. But she was aware of being witnessed in a way that did not diminish the dance. That expanded it. It was like the laundry room had always been the safest place, and the moonbeam had always been the freest place, and for the first time she felt both together in the same room, the safety of being known and the freedom of being seen, and the combination of the two was something she had not expected, something that opened rather than exposed. The blood magic moved through her arms as she danced. She had been working with it for 3 weeks, learning its rhythms, and it had learned hers. It amplified something in the dance, made visible the emotional architecture of it, the light trailing where her hands moved through the air. She did not look at him constantly, but when she turned in the natural arc of the dance, the turn that brought her facing his wall, she looked at him, and he was not the Kedrin of the corridor or the receiving room or the 6-second look across the hall. He was not managed or controlled or precise. He was watching her the way she had been watched only once before in her life, by her mother in the laundry room, with the expression of someone for whom you are the most important thing in the frame. She kept dancing, but something in the dance changed, something opened. Another layer she had not known was there, because she had not known until this moment that being seen completely and still, being safe was something that was possible for her. She had not known. Oh, the dance said, oh, this is what it can be. When she stopped the natural ending of it, the stillness that follows when the body has said everything it needed to say, she was breathing hard in the quiet room. He had not moved. She looked at him. He looked at her. That, he said, after a moment, is what you've been doing in this castle every night. Yes, all those weeks. Yes. He looked at the floor, then at her. The silver-gray eyes doing what they had been doing more and more, frequently allowing things through. Tiny increments of allowance. The glacier spring that had been happening for weeks now. I have spent 24 years, he said slowly, being told that the things that move you are the things that break you. That feeling something was the same as losing something. I know, she said. I don't think that's true. No, she said. It isn't. I think the things that move you are the things that... He stopped. He was not a man who had words for this. He had never needed them before. He was doing what she had watched him do slowly, painstakingly, for weeks, reaching for honest language in a vocabulary that had been built for control. She crossed the room. She sat down on the floor beside him, not in front, not across, beside, their shoulders nearly touching. The same position they had taken at the table in the library. You don't have to find the word, she said. I know what you mean. He looked at her. Do you? You mean that you were wrong, she said softly, and that you're glad you were wrong. He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. Their shoulders touched. The candlelight held them both. She turned her palm up. She didn't know exactly when she decided to. It happened in the way real things happen, not as a decision, as a fact that became visible. Her palm facing upward. The small cracked silver ring on its chain caught the candlelight. He looked at it, then at her face. His hand closed around hers. Not the wedding grip. She felt the difference immediately, felt it in the precise way that you feel after a lifetime of being handled, what it is to be held. His fingers wrapped around hers and the pressure of it was careful and certain, and it meant you, specifically, by name. She had held her mother's ring for 19 years as the one thing in the world that had been given to her with the grammar of you matter. This felt like that. Something moved through her face that she did not stop. For the first time in this castle, she did not stop it. He saw it. She knew he saw it. His eyes did not flinch away. I need to tell you something, he said. Yes, from the first night, the corridor, the mirror, yes, a pause. I stood there for 3 seconds. I know, she said. I saw you. He looked at her. You saw me. You came out of the shadow afterward. I'd already seen you, and you let me. I wanted to see what you would do. He was quiet for a moment. What did you decide? She thought about it honestly. That you were frightened, she said, and that frightened people do damage, and that I should be careful. You were right. I know. I did damage. Yes. He was holding her hand very carefully. She could feel his pulse in his fingers, slow, even. The contained pulse of a man keeping himself very still around something delicate. I'm going to keep doing better, he said. Not as a performance. Not because it's strategic. Because... He stopped again at the edge of the sentence. She waited. Because you are the most, he paused. I am not good with words for things that matter. I know, she said, very gently. You don't have to be. He looked at their hands. Will you tell me, he said, what you need? Not what the protocol requires. Not what makes the court function. What you, specifically, need. She thought about it. A room that is mine, she said. Not assigned, not managed. Actually mine. Done. The East Hall. No one to be sent here. This is my space. Done. And she paused. Stop being somewhere else when I'm in the room. He was quiet. I haven't been, for a while now, he said. She looked at him. He was right. She thought about the library, the council chamber, the tower, this floor, the consistent, incremental, undeniable weight of a man who had been, slowly, choosing the same direction over and over. No, she said. You haven't. The moonbeam moved across the floor as the night aged. His hand stayed. Her hand stayed. Neither of them moved to change it. She had been born in a cellar. She had been named for endurance. She had survived gray dresses and cold water and words like hollow and ghost and bastard and nothing. She had survived Drevhole Estate and the laundry room and the storage hall and the years of being someone else's problem dressed up as someone else's property. She had arrived in the coldest castle in the world with one trunk, one gown, one ring, and 19 years of very carefully held knowledge about how to survive rooms that did not want her. She had not been rescued. She had not been pitied into safety. She had read the founding treaties. She had mapped the court. She had stood in a vault of ancient magic and let it illuminate her blood. She had walked into a great hall of 200 people and spoken with a clear voice and a straight spine about what she was and what she was owed, and she had taken back, piece by piece, the shape of herself. He had been built of ice and taught to stay that way. He had stood in a corridor for 3 seconds and spent weeks punishing her for it. He had been wrong not in the small ways, but in the architectural ways, the foundational ones that everything else was built on. And then she had danced in a moonlit hall and something had cracked. Not broke, cracked. And through the crack, light. The mountains outside Drevhole Castle were ancient and indifferent and would outlast them both. But the dawn was real. His hand was real. Her blood magic, warm and golden at her wrists, was real. And Vaelith, who had been born below stairs, who had been sold to settle a debt, who had been the ghost and the bastard and the convenient face, stood in the east hall of her own castle in the first light of a new morning, belonging to herself first, and then carefully, honestly, with no performance and no management and no gray dress between her and the world, to him.
The people who survive the hardest rooms are not the ones who feel nothing, they are the ones who feel everything and choose to keep going anyway. Poverty is not the absence of worth. It is simply worth that has not yet been given a room large enough to stand in. This is Elite Divide where love rule.